Today's topic came about in 1928, and in the span of time since then, many things have been said to be the greatest things since its invention. The more I read about it and how easy it made people's lives, the more I realized the idiom about how great it is isn't too far off the mark. Because of this topic, sandwiches were made easier, toasters increased in sales and became a common wedding present, and breakfasts became easier to make on the fly. I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind sliced bread. But first, a quick message. One of the greatest things about having my own business is getting to finally think and talk about podcasting all day. And one of the things I do with ePodcast Productions is strategy sessions. These are 30 or 60-minute sessions where I go over a podcaster's show with them, look for ways to freshen them up, reach a bigger audience, offer new ideas, answer questions, or even talk to people who are thinking about podcasting as a sounding board and mentor to help lead them in the right direction that's specific to their show idea. If you're interested in freshening up your own show or starting a podcast, visit epodcastproductions.com and use the promo code STORYBEHIND for $25 off a strategy session. Hope to talk to you soon. If anyone has seen the 1982 movie Annie starring Aileen Quinn, Albert Finney, and Carol Burnett as many times as I did growing up, you might remember the scene in which Annie is telling Daddy Warbucks how his secretary Grace thinks he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Now, here's a goof in the movie. When Daddy Warbucks writes the checks to the Mudges, he dates it 1933, but the movie they went to see, Camille, wasn't released until 1936. Regardless of when the movie takes place, we know that Annie's phrase, greatest thing since sliced bread, doesn't really cover much, since sliced bread was invented only a few years prior, in 1928. Well, actually, if we're going to get technical, bread has been around since ancient times, when wheat grew along the Fertile Crescent, and it was discovered when wheat mixed with water and left on its own, it would rise. And when that risen dough was baked, it created bread, which some scholars attribute to being one of the factors that turned nomads into settlers, since water was available and bread was an easy way to feed a number of people without using many resources. It was even said bread was given as payment to workers who built the ancient pyramids in Egypt. And back then, it could be assumed people sliced bread by themselves. So sliced bread has been around for a while. But let's start with the man who invented the bread slicer. And from this point on, I'll be using pre-sliced bread and sliced bread interchangeably, by the way. Otto Rohwedder grew up in Iowa, then moved to Missouri to become a successful jeweler. He had the idea for pre-sliced bread, and he was so taken with this idea, he sold his jewelry stores and moved back to Iowa to begin working on his prototype. Unfortunately, after a few prototypes were built, the factory he was using burned down, including his machines and blueprints, but he didn't let that stop him. I'd make a joke about his work being toast, but nah, too easy. He kept going though, which worked to his favor when the toaster made its debut in 1926. Yeah, the toaster came before sliced bread, believe it or not. And unsurprisingly, it wasn't very popular until Otto perfected his machine and pre-sliced bread was finally available for the public. As you may know, when you have sliced bread and leave it out, the open end will go stale quite quickly. Otto needed to find a way to remedy this, so he looked for ways to keep the bread together. Unsliced bread was usually wrapped in cotton and kept in a bread box, but cotton wouldn't help when it came to keeping the slices fresh. Otto's first attempts failed, unfortunately, including one version in which he used hat pins or U-shaped pins to keep slices together, making the bread look more intact. The product, though, was not a success. When he began using wax paper and cellophane to wrap the sliced bread, keeping the loaves intact, sliced bread finally became successful, with pre-sliced bread outselling unsliced bread within a short period of time. Plus, no more pins stuck in slices of bread. Otto's new bread slicing machine included a mechanism to wrap the loaves, and after that, it was hard for him to keep up with the demand for bakeries. One of his earliest models is on display at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. During World War II, when the U.S. was beginning to put rations in place, the steel used in making bread slicers became scarce, prompting a ration put on pre-sliced bread. Apparently, this was up there as irritating to Americans as gas rationing. Time magazine commented on it in an article that included the passage,
US housewives vainly searched for grandmother's serrated bread knife, rooted sleepy husbands out of bed, held dawn conferences over bakery handouts, which read like a golf lesson. Keep your head down, keep your eye on the loaf, and don't bear down. Then came grief, cussing, lopsided slices which even the toaster refused, often a mad dash to the corner bakery for rolls.
Luckily, after 2 months, the ration on sliced bread was lifted. And maybe it was then that the phrase greatest thing since sliced bread gained more traction. By the way, if you're wondering what the greatest thing was before sliced bread, just know that while sliced bread was invented in 1928, Betty White was born in 1922. The snippet from Time magazine was read by Harriet Morris from the podcast Eating Coach, who is, funnily enough, working with me to help make healthier choices that don't always include sliced bread. Information for this episode was sourced from Time, the National Museum of American History, Today I Found Out, and more links which can be found in the show notes at thestorybehindpodcast.com. Want to talk more about this or past episodes? Find out about future episodes, enter giveaways, and more? Join me and other trivia buffs in the Story Behind discussion group on Facebook, and there will be a link in the show notes to take you there. This episode was brought to you by the Story Behind executive producers, who support the show through the Patreon page at patreon.com/thestorybehind. Thanks for listening.